And welcome everybody to the Vermont Climate Council Science and Data Subcommittee meeting for April 7th. We have a pretty full agenda as usual in a short amount of time here, so I'm gonna just dive right in. We'll go over the minutes, some administrative updates, if any, updates from other subcommittees. Then the meat of it is discussion of the request for proposals and draft work plan. Are there any comments on the main body of the agenda? Hearing none, I think we will go forward with that. And I just will remind folks, if you could please mute yourselves if you're not speaking, that would be helpful. Thank you. And it's great if just for the recording too, I can see some folks, but if you are subcommittee members, it'd be great to see you and see your video. It's the only time I'll ask. So miscellaneous administrative updates. I guess I'll turn it to you, Jane, to see if you have any administrative updates. I do have one thing I want to mention.
I actually, afternoon, everybody. I don't have anything at this moment, but I'm sure it'll come up in the course of conversation today. So thank you.
Great. The one thing I wanted to mention is how we and folks can stop me if they don't think this is the right time in the agenda for it, but how we deal with public comment, not deal with is the wrong word, but how we accept and engage the public in these meetings. And Leslie Ann and I have had some discussions, and just we want to try and change the way that we've been doing it, where we've just kind of waited till the end, and folks who have been watching and listening kind of get 10 minutes at the end with limited opportunity to respond and to see if we can engage a little sooner in terms of perhaps on a topic basis. Like today, the two main topics are request for proposals and the work plan, and then say, after we get done with the request for proposals, leave some opportunity for comment then, and then have that before, there's to the extent there's a decision being made by the committee, have the public have an opportunity to comment and chime in before that decision is made by the committee. And there's a risk to this, so I just want to kind of put it out there that I think it's trying it out, because we don't, we still, it's a balance. I'm not sure the best way to put this, but it's a balance of we still need to make sure we get the work of the committee done as well. So we can't have 45 minutes of public comment in the middle of the meeting. We won't get everything done. But I do want to make sure we're engaging and listening. And Leslie Ann, did you want to add anything to that?
So I just wanted to echo everything that you just said, TJ, and also to acknowledge that we received an additional email this morning, or maybe this afternoon, about half an hour ago, just before the meeting started. And so we're still in the process of figuring out the best way to receive all of these comments and questions and input coming in, but please don't stop doing so, because all of these are going to be benefiting us. So bear with us and be patient with us as we continue to find just the right mechanism for appreciating, acknowledging, and using the information that you continue to share. So, Steve, thank you for sending that, and looking forward to see how our trial run goes today.
Great. Any other buddy on the subcommittee like to chime in? So for the record, I see some thumbs up, and I actually am looking at the chat, and I noticed that I skipped over an agenda item. Thank you for pointing that out, Brian. So let's go back, having taken care of agenda item number 3, and go to approval of the minutes of the last 2 meetings. And I'll note, just so that we don't take up too much time, the 324 minutes, I see the comment in the chat that there was a spelling correction, so we can take care of that. Thank you, Jared. Any other comments on the last 2 sets of meeting minutes? So hearing none, we will say that those are approved, and we can move on to the 4th agenda item, which I've tried to be clever and call around the council, updates from the other subcommittees. I'm not very clever, so that's the best I could do. I guess I will look to those who maybe we have assigned, I guess, is not, or who have volunteered to be liaisons for the other committees. There may just be no update, but I want to give the opportunity there for an update.
So I think that's very positive. We did have a panel meeting yesterday that was environmental justice and public health. We had a representative from the American Lung Association.
Right, so that, I think somebody was not on mute, looks like. I'm not sure who was speaking there, but I guess I'll ask. So I'm not hearing any updates from other subcommittees. I will mention that the Just Transitions subcommittee is holding a public forum tonight, or a meeting tonight, for council members and subcommittee members on environmental justice and how to incorporate that in thinking. It will be recorded. If you can't make it, it's 6 to 8 o'clock tonight. I'm hoping to make it. I'm not sure that I can, but I plan to watch the recording because I think it's going to be very valuable. Does anybody else have any thoughts from any of the other subcommittees or the steering committee even?
I'm happy. Oh, you go ahead, Jared. I'll defer to you first.
Just quickly, I guess I could report out from the last cross-sector mitigation subcommittee meeting. A lot of that was focused, as we have been previously and will be today, on the discussion of the RFP draft. And I think one thing that came out of that meeting that may come up again today is the extent to which, in the current draft of the RFP, we are asking consultants to review the kind of strategies, policies, that subcommittee identifies, versus to what extent we ask the consultant to do kind of a broad independent review to come up with their own policies to model. I think that's a question we want to have some clarity about. My understanding from that cross-sector meeting was, they had report outs for each of the different task groups that are looking at the different kind of sectors in terms of the emissions reduction kind of strategies for transportation, buildings, and thermal, the power sector, and then the non-energy emissions. And so a lot of strategies and policy ideas are being identified, developed, and I just think that we'll want to be clear about to what extent that work is being shared with whoever we select as a consultant in response to that RFP, versus to what extent we are asking them to do their own or additional scanning around those type of opportunities beyond what gets identified by that cross-sector committee. But those are the main updates. It was a focus on the RFP and the kind of task group by sector, in terms of emissions reduction strategies kind of updates. But please, Jane, or if there's anybody else who is on that feels like there's anything else relevant to add, please do so.
Thanks, Jared. What I was actually going to speak to the the sort of coordinated discussions happening around the RFP and how they do all sort of seem to fall back to the purview of this subcommittee. And we'll get to that today, a little bit about process to where we go from here to finalize the RFP. But in addition to perhaps the comment that Jared just made about cross-sector, I'll say that in ag and ecosystems, as well as a bit in cross-sector, you know, the focus of the conversation, as well as public input, I'll just allude to, also has been around the greenhouse gas inventory and what gets done in the RFP, what gets done in DEC, and then also how that relates to the carbon budget condition scope of service, as well as how that relates to the monitoring and assessment framework that we're hoping to have developed by a consultant. And so I'll just sort of put a pin in it for this subcommittee as you're thinking about your work planning today and about how this subcommittee coordinates, considers sort of input from other committees that have a stake in the greenhouse gas inventory conversations and tracking mechanisms and carbon budget. So I think this subcommittee is sort of the home for all of that, but obviously other subcommittees have interest in that work. And then one other comment, sort of somewhat unrelated, just with respect to coordination and other work happening that will ultimately, I think, inform and help the work of this subcommittee, is the steering committee's focus last week, as well as where I think the steering committee at the next meeting next week, as well as the full council will go to, is working towards putting creating a substantive outline for the final, for what the climate action plan will look like. I think by doing that and having a conversation about that with everybody, that will help inform how subcommittee work feeds up into the climate action plan, as well as helps us develop the tools and templates needed for subcommittees to draft recommendations, strategies, responses. And so I just sort of say stay tuned, because I know people are anxious to sort of see the framework for the climate action plan, and we're really starting to dive into that, and I think that will be the meat of the April Climate Council meeting. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Jane and Jared. Okay, unless there's any other comment, I think we can continue apace here on the agenda and discuss the RFP. Jane sent around to the subcommittee, and I believe it's posted to the website, a revised draft RFP. And I think, Jane, why don't you tee that up in terms of process and what you think we need to talk about today? Yeah.
So thank you, everybody, for your patience in the 11th hour nature of how documents are coming around still. I'm really hopeful that we'll sort of overcome that in the next few weeks, but the RFP has been a really collaborative process, I'll say, which has been really great. I've gotten a ton of help along the way, initially from Jared and TJ and others, and sort of teeing up the digestion of the RFI and then ultimately producing the first draft of the RFP. Since then, all of the subcommittees that sort of have a technical role and a stake in the game, sort of with respect to the analysis in this first RFP, first, maybe last, but I suspect perhaps we might need some smaller contracts and/or grants also after this round is pushed out. But the Ag and Ecosystems Committee, as we just said, and the Cross-Sector Mitigation Committee took this the RFP up at their meetings after you all had taken it up last week. I did my best to incorporate feedback and comments from the Science and Data Committee, and then shared an updated draft with those two subcommittees. And where sort of they went, and where I'm actually hoping to model that process today with all of you, as we move to sort of a finalized RFP, is that in cross-sector, they delegated Jared and Christine to sort of help, Christine Donovan, who's a subcommittee member, as well as Jared, to help me refine certain scope of services components that related specifically to their work. We met and did that. And then also we in Ag and Ecosystems, I worked closely with Ali Kasiba, who's a climate forester within Forest Parks and Recreation, and staffs that subcommittee, to come up with more robust language around the carbon budget component of the RFP. and then are working with Ag and Ecosystems, other members who had a vested interest in that carbon budget component to further review that right now. And then I've since also met a number of times and thanked them profusely for their help with, and I know Megan O'Toole's on the call today, the air quality division staff thinking about how and what the greenhouse gas inventory component looks like. And I also got feedback from other subcommittee members on that point too. And so what I've shared with you now, and I have it open on my computer, and we could dive into if folks want to, but is a quite robust and different scope of services, I think, than what was in front of everybody last week. Not different in nature of what the real ultimate components are that we're asking for, but I'm hoping for that we've gotten it to a bit more clarity as well as interaction amongst the 5 components, having scaled back one of the components into one of the other ones. So we went from 6 scope of services to 5. And also from that, we're able to try to take a first stab at what the deliverables would be from each of those, which we hadn't done yet. Clearly stating the deliverables in order to take it from the scope of services into the performance measures section. And that's really a first draft at that. And I'm hoping our A&R business office, as well as Megan, who's on this call, the attorney for the air quality division, can also help me ensure that I've done a good job of sort of teeing up a way for the consultants to put forward a proposal that incorporates sort of their most ambitious timelines and cost about to meet those timelines. And so I think the RFP is really getting close. I'm happy to spend as much substantive time right now talking through the changes to the scope of services to highlight that for all of you. But then what I'd like to recommend that would be the best use of this subcommittee's time is that the steering committee has sort of signed off on the role of this subcommittee in input as sort of getting us to a final place for the RFP. Rather than sort of hold us back to meeting another week from now, which wouldn't allow us to post the RFP and go live with it until the end of next week, I'm hoping, sort of like the other subcommittees, that some volunteers might step up or be voluntold to sort of work closely with me to sort of incorporate any final edits, recognizing that at some point we sort of have to call it good with subcommittee and council input, and sort of allow agency staff, both our lawyers and our business office, to allow us to get it to the final draft and sort of close the door on feedback is where I'm feeling like I need to get to. So again, happy to walk through the scope of services today. Also happy to just have an open dialogue about next steps and allow for what I mentioned in my email, a period of time for folks to still get back feedback to me in the next few days. What I'd like to say is by the end of Friday, knowing that there would be 1, 2, maybe 3 of you who would work closely with me to incorporate any of that feedback that we want to put into the RFP at this point. So why don't I just pause there and suggest if just sort of 1, if what I'm saying resonates with everybody, and 2, based on yeses or nos, let me know how deep you'd like to go in review of the RFP right now, or if you'd like to really further nail down the process for getting it to a final point, and therefore allowing for that detailed review to happen outside of this meeting to allow you to get to work planning. Jared.
I would say that I think that process sounds great, and I would volunteer to continue being involved, and that would be helpful. I do think that there is a component of it, of the current draft of the RFP, that's worth surfacing for some additional attention by this group. But I'm happy to hold on raising that question until others have had a chance to respond on the questions that you just posed, Jane.
That sounds great. Thanks.
Other
So
committee members Oh yeah, go ahead, Leslie.
I was about to say, so I haven't had a chance to dive into looking at it at all because of my office hours today, and there's part of me that wants to sort of process and give feedback, and then the other part of me understands the timeline that we're trying to do this on. There's always benefit in having a group discussion, and so my it's not a concern, but I just wanted to raise if a lot of the feedback came after as written feedback, then we would miss some of that dynamics of the back and forth of sort of sharing. And so I don't necessarily call for another meeting, but I just wanted to point out that fact that we're going to miss some of that group dynamic of, being able to share and kind of go back and forth if all of it comes in written, like 6 pages per person, which you don't want. But you know what I mean?
Yeah. I don't want 6 pages per person.
I know you don't 6 pages per person, but there's something about being in a group and talking things through
I
and having a
appreciate that, yeah.
chance to process. Brian.
Thanks, Leslie, and I appreciate that. Brian, go ahead.
Yeah, so I would it would be helpful for me just to understand at a high level the changes from the previous version of the scope to what we have in front of us today. If you could just highlight those for me, that would be really helpful.
Is there consensus on that? Because I think my preference, if I was going to do that, would be to share it real quick and just talk through the five main services now being requested.
Yeah, I think you saw a bunch of thumbs up there, Jane.
Yeah, I felt it. Let's see which one. I can't believe I have 2 open on my computer right now. Which one do I want? Hold on.
I'm surprised you just have 2.
I know.
Given all the feedback you've been collecting.
Let's see. Of course, the presenting is not. Okay, that's the right direction. Yes. Okay. All right. So I'll say broadly that comments throughout have been around, 1, clearly articulating the roles of the different subcommittees where they're related to the work. So setting up the expectation of the consultants are clearly working for the agency, and I think that's important to clarify, but also that the Climate Council and the subcommittees are these audiences that have a stake and a role in considering input along the way, both, as we've discussed in the past, both hearing preliminary results, but also first and foremost, helping ensure that the approach to the work and the methodologies are in line with our understanding of how the work should advance, understanding that there's a lot of expertise within the subcommittees and on the council. So that, and then also clearly teeing up and recognizing the long-term needs of how we manage and ensure this data, not data, but process and data to a lesser extent, have a home long-term in the agency, and therefore thinking about sort of the accessibility of the products that we're getting and how specifically to likely call out DEC will have a long-term stake in helping us manage this. So how it relates to the greenhouse gas inventory, the changes we might make in that process, and then the long-term sort of analysis and replicability of some of the tools that will get created. That specifically relates, I'll say, to the carbon budget, because that will be a moment in time that we get, but we'll want to be able to replicate that going forward for other plans. So the first greenhouse gas inventory component of the plan, we've had a lot of back and forth. I don't want to be 100% sure that this is the exact language where we'll end here with the greenhouse gas inventory, but mindful that it's been a while since DEC has had a review of the way we do our greenhouse gas inventory, where their DEC staff seem very open to considering it, but also mindful that the not wanting to get into the weeds of like the EPA protocols, like we don't want to be paying a contractor to be looking at the methodology of an EPA protocol that we're using, trying to target their time and energy to the right facets of the spots within the inventory that could be easily changed or considered with respect to the way we do it. And so that again is just, and then of course, there's a lot of attention around the consideration and development of a life cycle and or consumption-based inventory and how they will present that to us and the pros and cons of how we would do that. You know, specifically starting to think about, you know, double counting with life cycle emissions and how other states, if they're using life cycle emissions inventories, deal with those kinds of complications. And so, you know, this is one of the first, and I'll just say then below this, the deliverable, you know, is one of the first things I think will come out of this contract, right? The carbon budget, as well as the greenhouse gas inventory critique, I'll say for now, for lack of better detail term, that will be the first thing that will sort of have the contractor embark on, recognizing other components of the work can also be started, but some of the components of the technical analyses will need to wait on components of the comprehensive energy plan analyses and DEC contract analyses to be done with NESCOM and SEI. So again, here, there's been some language change here to conform with the DEC's thoughts, but not a lot of substance has changed here around this, I'll just say. But there has been language changes, so I encourage you to look at how we've refined the language. You may or may not remember that all it said before for number 2, because it was a sub bullet of number 1, was develop a carbon budget pretty closely. Allie's really put a lot of flesh on this, and then the DEC has looked even more closely at it and how it relates to their understanding of how it would tie back to the greenhouse gas inventory. And so Allie listed these all out here as possible stocks and fluxes to include. One idea from DEC that I haven't fleshed out yet, whether is just to ensure that these are the same things that are in the IPCC protocol, and whether or not we need to actually list them all out or just reference what we want them to be looking at. But for now, they're here. And you know, again, encourage folks to look at the carbon budget the way it's been fleshed out. And I will be doing that specifically with ag and ecosystems more closely as a subgroup later this week. The tasks. Number 3, I think that we have refined and recognized clearer language in number 3. Both Christine Donovan, who's on the cross-sector mitigation committee, helped me with this in calling out sort of the pathways and the sectors that are in the law and calling out the GWSA targets here. But generally, this has stayed the same. It also, in the economic analysis, speaks to sort of like, there's the business as usual case before. It actually almost read as that's all we wanted them to analyze, but we really wanted to make clear here that it's the business as usual case compared to sort of the other the requirements and scenarios that we put forward to meet the statutory requirements for the greenhouse gas reductions. So that hasn't changed much. And then I call everybody's attention to look at how I, by myself, nobody's actually reviewed this yet, the deliverables that I put, trying to sum up what the deliverables were coming out of all these for 1, 2, and 3. Number 4 has had a lot of reworking done by cross-sector mitigation staff, Jared and Christine, and what it did was it pulled in what felt like a sort of standalone number 5 scope of task that was speaking to sort of, oh, I just noticed a typo, so I'll fix the typo while we're talking. Oh, I can't fix it. So anyway, hold on. The number 4 spoke to is really getting at the work that cross-sector is doing.
Hey, Jane, sorry,
yeah,
I just wonder if anyone else is having the same problem I'm having, which is I just see a black screen right now. I seem to have lost your document.
Oh,
it looks like Brian is also just,
Hold on, let me stop sharing and then I'll start sharing. Did that just happen when I hit enable editing?
I think so.
Is that back up now?
Yep, now we can see.
Okay, so number 4 was really focused on the work of cross-sector mitigation. And if you remember, number 5 really talked about sort of the 3 different levels of targets that were, the statutory requirements for 2025, 2030, and 2050. And really what Christine thought about was digesting that number 4 and how to convey that as deliverables for consultants to review and look at. And she thought more about the packages that the consultants will be helping us refine with input from cross-sector, iterative input around the components needed to meet the 2025 goal, the 2030, and the 2050 ultimately, and how we back off sort of level of specificity for this plan for each one of those targets. So she moved that all in to there. And then the final one is still, was number 6, is now number 5, which really gets at that framework for how we're going to track not greenhouse gas inventory, but how we track what each policy that we're putting in place has for implications for how it's helping us meet our greenhouse gas reduction targets. And I've just, starting to understand this a little better with DEC, recognize how complicated and challenging that will be. And yeah, just like how if you recommend and actually pursue and get 80,000 EVs on the road, how it might not have the carbon reduction that you can anticipate clearly if everybody else decides to go buy pickup trucks that year. And so anyway, just starting to think about how those things relate and how they'll be working consistently with ANR and DEC specifically to ensure that we have the capability to actually use that tracking and monitoring system consistently with our greenhouse gas inventory going forward. And then this, I'll just highlight this. This has been really beefed up. I don't think this is the role of the subcommittee, but I might call on TJ with his expertise, but I've tried to put together in here some proposed timelines for each one of these tasks. And I'm not sure yet if I've done a realistic job of doing that. So we'll see how where I get to with that. So I'm going to stop sharing unless anybody wants to look at it more closely.
So I guess I have a question, from what Jared mentioned in the report on what the cross-sector committee had done and what it looked like very briefly, and looking at what you just put on the screen, Jane, that the cross-sector committee has decided that it wants the contractor to come up with, identify policies and evaluate them, as opposed to the other option of just evaluate the policies that
Yeah,
I think it's the reverse, TJ.
Okay.
And I don't know as though, Jane, you've
Yeah.
done an incredible amount of work expanding, adding more detail to this, but I do think it's worth making sure in question 4 or in section 4 that it's clear that we're asking them to model and do analysis of the policies that get identified by the cross-sector mitigation committee, not to limit it to those, because they may, identify other options that should be modeled. But I think right now it kind of reads as though we're asking them to do a scan of every possible policy and make a recommendation about what they would model. I think the cross-sector mitigation committee is giving them a starting point that shouldn't necessarily be limited or exclusive, but is a very strong starting point. That's my understanding of what the cross-sector mitigation committee.
That's clearly my understanding too. So we'll make sure we look at that language clearly to make sure that's what we're getting at, because that's what we're trying to do. But there was also a recognition that the consultant may bring added value and perspective that we were open to hearing, and that it should be an iterative relationship.
Right. It may say that there. I just it's the only time I saw it is when you had it up on the screen. So other discussion. I just want to leave it open and see if anybody else had any comments on the changes that they wanted to share.
Yeah, I just I saw somewhere, I think it was bullet point 3, the social cost of carbon, and I think I saw the word development in there, and I'm not sure if we wanted that to be something more oriented towards reviewing available literature, internationally accepted standards.
Yeah, I have something about that, but I'm sorry that I don't have it up anymore, but let me. The social cost of carbon. Yes, it talks about an appropriate social cost of carbon value based on a literature review, including the key choice of discount rate that can be used to inform cost effectiveness analysis based on marginal damage and marginal abatement approach. This could include surveying climate counselors and subcommittee members to gain insight to an appropriate discount rate. Is that the one you're speaking to? There's also the one that ties back to the cost, not the social, but the cost of carbon work that's been already done by the Public Service Department.
I think that description that you just read, Jane, sounds good. I think the challenge might be in the deliverable language, because it says develop a social cost of carbon. So I agree with Lou that if we could kind of change that to, frame up options for a choice of the social cost of carbon based on the literature review, rather, because develop makes it could be misinterpreted.
Thank you.
So I agree with that. I also am thinking that we could probably wordsmith on this call for quite a while, and so I want to I guess focus on the process. And so, having heard the changes that to the scope of work, Jane recommended a process where we assign 1 to 3 people to essentially represent the subcommittee. There's pros and cons to that approach, as Dr. Dupini-Giroux mentioned, and I just want to open the floor to other comments on that process, and is that the best way to move forward here?
I will say, just as sort of to complement both processes, that the way that those delegates have been working is for us to have a meeting where we speak and have some dialogue and discourse about the comments received. So I think perhaps we could sort of have a marriage of the two, just with a smaller group, allowing us to advance more quickly.
I guess the one question I have is that if the Science and Data Committee has been essentially delegated the responsibility to quote unquote approve the RFP, are we then kind of sub-delegating that to a couple of members of this committee? And I just want to make that clear if that's the case. And I'm not sure exactly what I think of that, but is that effectively what happens?
Yes, and yes, that is how I view it. And I guess I would ask first and foremost if there are glaring omissions or challenges with the scope of services right now that is not sitting well with this subcommittee. And then I might say, let's hold this and bring it back to the subcommittee next Wednesday. If we feel like we have the meat there, and it's a matter of wordsmithing, clarifying, sort of building upon that right now, then I think that delegation feels really appropriate, because you're signing off on the sort of substance of the RFP at this point, which I am really hopeful that we are at right now with the amount of input I've gotten, but we'll just pause there to see if anybody feels like we're not.
Doesn't sound like it. And I also, I guess, would point out that this is the RFP is important. It's also just the RFP. There's opportunity to shape the scope of work when the contractor comes back with a proposal. We're going to have some tasks there, and to make sure that we're getting the right scope of work as well. So I'm about to call the question specifically, but before I do that, I want to be true to what I started the meeting with and say, before we're calling a question on that, give a few minutes for for public comment here and to get some input from those on the line that may have something to say. And I guess in doing that, I want to try and focus on the process if possible, and not the substance, because I think we could talk about the substance over, a lot, and take up the rest of the meeting with that. And I want to have the window here, but not not take up the whole meeting, I guess. And before, George, I saw you pop up on the screen, and hang on 1 second, as I want to let subcommittee member Duval, Jared, your hand is up.
Thanks, TJ. I'll just briefly say that I think that the process sounds good. I do want to raise an area of kind of substance content that I think is as we go through that process of final review, worth further attention and maybe worth discussion today. And that relates to number 1 on the greenhouse gas emissions inventory. I think it's very clear in number 1 that there's an intent around assessing alignment with EPA guidance and IPCC protocol. I'll say I start this conversation with anytime we talk about phenomenally complex topics like this, I think it's good to remind myself that to approach it with humility and curiosity and an effort to learn. But I will say that my understanding of the current GHG inventory, an in-boundary sector or production-based inventory, is that it is very closely following and appropriately following IPCC protocol and EPA guidance. I think the challenge emerges in either a lack of clarity or potential inconsistency between that approach and some of the language that we see in statute in terms of the law that governs the inventory and in terms of the language in the Global Warming Solutions Act. So and I don't know what to do about that. I don't know to what extent a contractor can help us with that. I don't know to what extent that is a topic for review internally with the agency, for discussion with the legislature. I don't know, but I'm just going to flag it because I think it's important. And that is, if you look at 10 VSA 582, which is the part of statute that governs our greenhouse gas inventories, on the one hand, it says that, this is section 2E. It says that we should make reasonable efforts. Well, and this regards existing and proposed international, federal, and state greenhouse gas emissions reporting programs, which I think we are very much consistent with. And then it says, make reasonable efforts to promote consistency among those reporting programs and to streamline reporting requirements. So hold that in one part of our mind. Then later in that same statute, section G, it calls for use of life cycle accounting. And I'm going to put something in the message that kind of, it's a link that the EPA put out that basically distinguishes between a greenhouse gas emissions inventory versus life cycle emissions accounting. And basically the guidance from EPA is they are both relevant, important ways to understand emissions, but they are different products, different processes that can't be mixed because both of time and geography differences between life cycle accounting versus an in-boundary accounting. And so I think that a question is, given that 582 specifically says that directs towards life cycle accounting, and that in the Global Warming Solutions Act, it talks about emissions not just from within Vermont, but resulting I can't remember the exact language, from the use of energy or consumption of energy in Vermont, including emissions beyond Vermont's borders. Those things to me feel fundamentally inconsistent. And I think in order to get at that question of life cycle or at the question of emissions outside of our borders, that requires an approach that is different than our existing inventory, that is different than what most states and countries do following IPCC and EPA guidance. And I just think it is worth us having clarity and transparency about how we come to resolution about that question, and to what extent we're asking for consultant support in doing so in this RFP. I think it's in there to the extent that we do flag, the ways in which we could account for life cycle emissions. But I do think it would probably be worth referencing in the RFP as a kind of reference point, not just EPA and IPCC, but that there are these two pieces of Vermont statute that also speak to the way the inventory is supposed to be, they want the inventory to be conducted, that to me don't read to be totally consistent. And we have to figure out.
Thanks, Jared. I'm not sure whose hand was up next. Julie, do you want to respond?
I will, just because it's brief, and then I think Megan may be able to help clarify as the lawyer among us. I was just going to flag, I think, Jared, in addition to the pieces of existing statute you referenced, it would be important to look at what the intent of the Global Warming Solutions Act is, because I'm not sure it's fully aligned, and specifically we're being asked to measure emissions against baselines, and if we start changing the baseline, what happens then is a whole cascading set of questions, and maybe that's what Megan was going to speak to. But I think and measuring net zero is also another term of art in there, and just would flag that I think you're right, there is some inherent differences, apologies for the dog, in the statute, in those parts of the statute you cited, but also I'm not sure that in drafting the Global Warming Solutions Act, we looked at exactly how those would integrate either.
Right, Megan, do you have more clarification for us?
Not too much more. Thank you, Julie. That was those are a lot of the points that I was going to mention as well. But I guess I just wanted to respond, Jared, to your comments by, hopefully, pointing out that one of the edits and that I think that Jane highlighted is that in that first task, we do specifically kind of call out that task as being completed more in close collaboration with the agency, so that we can explore some of these questions and take kind of a more collaborative approach with the contractor in completing that work. And one other reason for that as well is, in Section 582, the agency has been delegated the authority to figure out how we're going to design and then implement the inventory, obviously within the bounds of the somewhat curious language in that statute, but that that is a responsibility that the agency has been given by the legislature, and so we feel it's appropriate to work really closely with the contractor if there's going to be an exploration of the various components that go into designing and executing the inventory. And I'll also point out that the Climate Council does have the opportunity in the climate plan to highlight for the legislature opportunities for modifying statutory language if the council feels that that's appropriate. So, if we do find that there's an opportunity to resolve some of this inconsistency, that's another opportunity for that recommendation to be made. But, hopefully we can reconcile as much as possible, during this initial process. But I just wanted to point that out as well.
Great. Thank you all. So I think what I heard, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that RFP task 1 needs to be written broadly enough to consider these issues and provide recommendations on them, and in light of the the statute and the guidelines and the current inventory, and in collaboration with the agency. Is that a fair summary?
I like that summary.
Thank you for bringing that up, Jared. I think that's an important point that we need to make sure we're addressing, and in the RFP and beyond. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the process question that we have on the table, and the opportunity for some public comment. And thank you for being patient, George Gross. You have your hand up.
Afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. I think this would be a very strong contribution to your public engagement process, and I'll try to be expeditious. I know your time is short here, and there's others waiting. As you're aware, Steve Croy and I and others have just sent you a document this afternoon, that speaks to the RFP. I think it was mostly written prior to today's publication of the revised draft, and honestly, I haven't had a full opportunity to review it. What I had started to do independent of this morning's document that we sent was to write a possible way to finesse or sort of split the difference between these two different tensions. You've mentioned the word consistency in your conversations multiple times. I prepared a statement that was going to speak to that issue. I guess I could read it to you if you allow me, and we could offer to discuss it if you see there's merit in doing so. So what I would say is, independent of the statutory obligation or not to do life cycle emissions accounting, the primary reason for the council to develop its own Vermont energy consumption life cycle greenhouse gas emissions inventory methodology is to make sound policy decisions. This methodology could steer the Vermont Climate Council towards a successful solution because it counts all the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions entering the atmosphere, regardless of their spatial location or their timeline proximity to where and when the fuel's combustion occurs. If you look at the different use cases that a tool like this would have, you could use it independent of the ones that you still do in a regulatory context. In other words, it'd be a tool that's custom to the needs of your work. And it's particularly designed, obviously, to look under the hood, as it were, at the total life cycle of the energy fuels and sources that we use today in Vermont. So the most obvious example, for example, would be the trade-offs you get in considering the substitution of one of two candidate biofuels in place of an incumbent diesel or gasoline fuel. If you fail to include in your decision-making the life cycle assessment of each fuel's respective upstream emissions, could easily lead to an erroneous greenhouse gas inventory statement that overstates the benefits accrued by deploying the selected biofuel. And this is just one example. If we look at the New England grid and what they're doing in their power mix, and we're trying to understand as we electrify things, whether or not we're on track, it stands to reason we should look carefully at the total emissions caused by New England's emissions, not only at the combustion in the boiler or at the gas turbine, but upstream from those fuels, the life cycle emissions that influence, in other words, when we increase our electric use, we obviously are going to increase our greenhouse gas emissions indirectly, and it behooves us to do an accurate assessment of what that is. Hydroelectric is another example where we know there are emissions upstream from this source, but we've not yet stepped up to quantify them. And this would be a good example of something you would want to outsource to a tech service that is actually savvy and using satellite data to evaluate the reservoir region and show that it is in fact a carbon and methane source, as compared to, say, an adjacent area that's just a sink. Woody biomass is still another. So all these cases, use cases, are examples where the council has to make tough decisions about which policy to proceed with. And I guess the last thing I will say for it is, in your RFP, you would probably be wise to consider sketching out these use cases as candidate things to consider about what you're trying to solve, and have the consultants' work program address them. So if we don't have an emissions factor that's credible today, but it can be provisional, have the consultant step up to doing a refinement on it and put in a real value that you're more comfortable with. And I think that covers all the bases with regards to this topic. I hope that advances the ball a bit as far as our mutual understanding.
Right. Thank you, George. And I guess sorry, I'm getting an echo here. If folks could mute. Okay, thank you. I'm hopeful that the process that we're outlining for the RFP is casting a wide enough net to consider those things, in that, you know, reasonable. I think there's reasonable people could disagree on certain aspects of, you know, how you count emissions from the region versus procurements. But you know, that's not a question for today. It's really, the question for today is, are we structuring the RFP so that the consultant, you know, kind of weighs those things, tells us the pros and cons of different approaches, and makes a recommendation potentially. And similarly, you know, and not necessarily on a technology specific basis. You know, we may think we need more on information on hydro life cycle emissions, but we can't do it for one technology and not do it for, I don't know, the lithium ion in batteries, for example, or any other technology that. So I'm hopeful that, again, the RFP is broad enough to capture all of that and say, what are the right methodologies, agnostic to the technology, really, and here are the options, here's the pros and cons and the different considerations, and then bring that to the Climate Council for consideration. I see one more hand up. Before Steve Crowley, before I get to you, I just want to do a chime check, because I feel like I know this is very important, and I don't know if it's my management of these meetings, but we seem to always end up only doing one topic, and I'm concerned about you know, not getting to a work plan, ever getting to developing a work plan so that we can do the work. But with that, I still am going to, Steve, if you can be brief there, please go ahead.
And just before Steve jumps in, I think it's actually really, really helpful to hear some of these right now. And maybe you and I can chit chat after about the agenda planning, so that we maybe strategize a little bit better. But remember, this is a trial, so let's see how the trial goes.
Right.
Okay, I apologize if there's background noise. I'm in a bad place for sound here, but I just want to make a very quick comment about your discussion about the apparent conflict between the two different types of uses of the models that you want to create. And I don't think there's an actual conflict. I think the conflict only arises if you try to make them be the same thing. They're really two different requirements. There's the EPA reporting requirement, where you really want to avoid double counting with different states. But there's the language in the Global Warming Solutions Act that talks about what we are really responsible for and what we can reasonably have a handle on. So it's a pretty direct link from our fuel use here to right up the pipeline. And that's you know, that's not it's not going to catch, but it catches our energy use. So I think the conflict only arises when you try to make them the same thing and they're not. So anyway, I'll end it there, and thank you. Appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you, Steve. I appreciate the comment. I'm not sure if there's a response to that, but I think what you're saying is that there's you know, it's not an either or, and it could be both. Okay, so I think with that public comment, and thank you both for commenting. I want to, sorry, I'm just checking to make sure there's not a new hand. And there is. I'm glad I checked. Mark Whitworth, you have a comment?
Yeah, I just want to amplify what Steve just said. And if we are trying to account for what we are responsible for, you know, I have a house full of stuff here, and I exported the greenhouse gas emissions associated with required for the production of all of it to other locations. You know, with the exception of maple syrup and my socks, everything has been imported, and you know, a lot of our what we are responsible for are a result of lifestyle choices, and influencing people's lifestyle choices is probably the most important thing we can do in impacting, affecting our contribution to climate change.
Great. Thank you for that, Mark. And again, I'm hopeful that the RFP is casting a wide enough net that we get input on the methodologies from our consultant to recommend a path forward. Colin, I see your hand. Colin Smythe from DEC.
Thanks, TJ. I just wanted to throw in my 2 cents just very briefly here. In that I think that both the life cycle and consumption, and I think they are not necessarily one and the same type of inventory, but I think those are both critically important for kind of policy decision making. I do, however, think that there is a difference between the current inventory and a life cycle, and I'm not sure I agree with the fact that you can kind of combine the two, because it seems kind of disingenuous to me to account for life cycle emissions from one piece of the inventory and not account for them in all the other pieces, in terms of prioritizing mitigation strategies, things like that. So I think a lot of future discussion should probably go into this, and I'd be happy to talk more, but those are just my 2 thoughts quickly.
Great, thank you, Colin. And I guess I'll ask folks to, if you can just put your hand down after you speak, so that I know when the hands are fresh and clean.
Richard had a request in the chat about moving the discussion out of the umbrella of the RFP because he's recused himself and would like to rejoin the conversation.
I think we can. So why don't we call that question on the, well, this is the RFP process internal, so I think he can come back. You can come back, Richard, unless anybody has any objections to that, because it's not specific to kind of the question I'm going to ask is just the process. I guess I'll ask it in this way. Are there objections to the process that Jane outlined to assign, 1 to 3 members of the subcommittee to discuss the or to make further comments and do the final refinements on the RFP in light of the conversation today and the new draft.
TJ, this is Julie. I would just offer that I would feel like I'm taking a double bite at the apple potentially by being inside the agency and outside the agency. So don't intend to volunteer myself in the capacity of the subcommittee.
Great, thank you for that, Julie. So I don't hear any objections to that process. Although maybe we should have seen who the volunteers were first, and somebody might have objected. But are there volunteers on the to take that next step? Jared, I see you as a volunteer, and this is, again, Jane, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is to review the RFP, provide final comments in light of the conversations here and the changes, and do that by Friday, I believe.
Thank you. Yes, that was right.
So Brian, are you volunteering there? Okay. So I'm kind of half in the boat of Julie. I think especially as it relates to the comprehensive energy plan, I need to review that section again and some of the other pieces that implicate the public service department, like the cost of carbon model. So I'll be looking at it as well. I don't know if that will be during a normal workday, but we'll look at it as well and try and get comments by Friday.
That's great, everyone. Thank you.
Okay, so I want to recognize that it's 2:40, and I don't think we're going to have time to get into a substantive discussion on the work plan, unfortunately. I do think that it'll be useful to kind of give a high level of the process that we're thinking about. And so you'll recall that the last week I had sent out a detailed draft of work plan, which was largely me taking the discussions around the scope and trying to put those in a timeline and bring up a few questions that that I seemed, there is a partial set of questions that could really help us achieve the goals of the scope, at least a draft of those in my mind. I did receive a markup and some written questions from a couple of you, but and thank you for that. And I think we will get into those specifics down the road. So but in talking with Leslie Ann about the scope of the committee, I think we thought it might be useful to take a step back and at a high level have some subcommittee discussions on just really what science and data do we need to complete our scope, and what sources do we need to tap, et cetera. And so I think maybe Leslie Ann, you may be able to better describe kind of that high level look that we want to, scope that we want, or hoping to engage kind of a better conversation about our path forward.
Right, thanks, TJ. So what I was thinking was we have spent a lot of time in our meetings so far talking about a couple different sectors. And since we are looking at science and data, broadly speaking, as TJ said, it might help to take a step back and look at all the various types of science and data that should be or could be part of our discussion in looking at climate change and the mitigation of climate change in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And then from there, sort of parse out which ones we could be tackling for our subcommittee for the time frame that we have, and which ones could be sort of down the road, given the fact that the plan is not a static plan. It's a living plan. It's every 4 years being revisited, and so the thinking is to make sure that we're trying to be as inclusive as possible. I was going to say comprehensive, but we always say the comprehensive energy plan, so I'm not going to use the word comprehensive. So inclusive in terms of all of the ways that we could be thinking about science and data from a start to finish. And so I try to kind of mock up like a moving set of diagrams on this, and this is where I reached out to Catherine, TJ, and I had a quick conversation, a quick demo of a tool called Idea Flip, that we're going to try to use to capture some of those ideas, sort of like crowdsourcing. And I'm going to tell you from right off the bat, it's messy, but that's okay, because out of the mess comes something that you can actually use. So if you have a little bit more of a sort of linear approach to things, we will get there. But in the meantime, it's great to capture all of the ideas at the get-go, so then we don't get caught with our socks down later on with like, I wish we had, or we should have pursued such and such. So that's sort of like the backdrop against this. And because we are at almost 1:45, and we may want to at least just see what the tool looks like. And then Catherine, if you wouldn't mind popping on and not just talking about it, but also saying if it can stay on for a while as folks sort of ruminate, because I know I work better when I've had a chance to think about stuff and then either talk about it or then add the various feedback. I think it might be helpful for our group to actually see the tool and see some of the thinking behind it, and then over the next few days be adding some of their sticky notes to that. So if you wouldn't mind, Catherine.
Absolutely. I think that's a good idea. So I leave this open once it's created and you have the link, which you got in TJ's email for this meeting. You can go in there at any time at your leisure and populate it with your ideas. But let me just give you first a good overview. I see there are a few of you that are already in there and may have set up you're not really setting up an account, you're just setting up an access, an entry name and password, but it's not downloading anything to your system. So that might be the first step that you encounter, is that when you go to that link, it'll ask you to set up an account. And once you get in here, and I'm going to share my screen, so I hope this isn't too confusing for those of you who have, can I share my screen? Yes. So I'm going to share my screen where I have this open, just to maybe point out a few of the key elements. We try to keep this pretty simple and straightforward. So we're really just asking you to think about this in these 3 dimensions. What would you want or need for this, to support this in terms of the science and data? Writ large. Think inclusively, and think about what things that you would find useful to support the work that's going to go forward for the Climate Action Council. Where might we get that? It's been very helpful to have this discussion about the RFP, because you can start to integrate what is going to be coming from the technical consultant with other data and other gaps that you see that you would like to have as well. And maybe this will help inform also as you're reviewing the RFP itself. But we already know there's lots of information out there. We are trying as much as possible to identify where those sources are so that we're not duplicating effort, starting from scratch. And then finally, and I would say very integral to this question, is the stakeholders that you want to reach out to, that you need to be sure are consulted along the way. These are the stakeholders that might be using the information. These are the stakeholders that might be the source of information. But all the folks out there that you think need to be connected with, so that you understand and make sure that the data and science is meeting their needs as well. So in these 3 categories, we're simply asking you to, on the right-hand side of your screen, if you've gone to this link, to click on the Post-it notes under the category of stuff to add. All you have to do is click on that, drag it over into the column that you wish to enter your idea, double click it, it'll open up a little text box. You fill in the text box, and your idea should be saved to the platform. You decide you don't want that idea, or you want to just acknowledge somebody else's idea. There are ways that you can put this back in the trash. There's a little trash bin in that text box, or you can, if you wanted to, instead of replicate it somebody else's idea, just indicate that you agree and you're in. There are some check boxes. There's some smiley faces. There's ways that you can show that you're on board with that particular idea. And that list of stuff to add. That's basically all you need. I think we sent you some instructions for, you hit shift and your mouse. If you want to make it bigger, you can navigate around the board and make the whole whiteboard itself larger by just hitting shift or using your trackpad with your fingers. It's pretty simple, pretty straightforward. There are instructions online here. If you click on the idea flip icon in the top right, that will bring down a menu that one of which is how do I use this if you need some help. And there's at the bottom left of your screen, you should see icons to zoom in and zoom out. That's it. I think it would be helpful as Leslie Ann suggested, if we just leave this up, let people work on it at their leisure. But let me stop. And the other thing we had hoped to do, which we can begin now, but we don't have a lot of time. We wanted to also give the public a chance to participate, not directly on the board, but through the chat. So if you have some info, I saw somebody already posted something about it, some information sources, you could just put in the chat, science and data, S&D, and your comment, or sources and your comment, or stakeholders and your comment. We can also capture that and transfer it to the board directly, or at least keep a record of it so that we're getting your input as well. There's lots of experts, and I know lots of experts and people with the knowledge that are in the public domain here. So we want to make sure we're hearing from you. Let me see if you've got questions or if people are struggling with this that have actually tried to get in. Is there anything I can answer that might make this easier for you right now? Let's see, can I see hands? Anybody have any questions?
Thanks, Catherine. I think that was a great high-level overview. And as you were talking, I was trying to drop some stuff in so that people could see how it worked in real time. So I added stuff like BCGI, for example, trying to capture George's comment about using satellite information, so satellite and air photos. Air photos had come up in some of our previous subcommittee conversations. So just trying to capture some of the things that we've been talking about and maybe some of the other pieces that we haven't had a chance to talk about. So it's a great way to just sort of amalgamate on what would have been a flip chart or a big whiteboard and move these stickies around. And maybe if you scroll down a little bit, Catherine, to where you can see some of those buttons and badges, if there's something that's already up there, if somebody wanted to sort of tag that. Yeah.
Yep, sure. There you go. So you can, there's your dots, your checks, your X's, your thumbs up, your thumbs down. Got all kinds of options here. Your 1-star, 2-star, 3-star. But yeah, I think those are helpful if you just want to pile on some of your ideas.
So Jared, did you have a comment or a question?
Yeah, I just quickly, I really appreciate the introduction, the suggestion of, and the introduction to this tool, Catherine and Leslie. And I guess one of the things that I'm struggling with is I feel like the universe of science and data and sources and stakeholders is potentially very, very large. And I can see how this would really help us do our work efficiently and collaboratively, but maybe this is just the way my brain works. I wonder if it's useful to pair, and maybe this is where you're going, but pair this with the discussion of the work plan. Like, it's easier for me to think about what are the sources that we need and what are the stakeholders as we get to specific goals and tasks in the work plan, rather than just kind of writ large all about science and data. So I'm hopeful that maybe we can utilize this in future meetings as well, but I'm just wondering if it makes the most sense to use it in relation to what we're trying, the goals or the tasks in our work plan.
And I understand the question, Jared. I think maybe our brains work the opposite way. So for my brain, sometimes it's helpful to, and I think this goes back to Richard's point a couple times back, where seeing the end goal kind of helps with working backwards to the various pieces that fit into the end goal. And so what I'm trying to do is to have us do like this. So we have some of those tasks that TJ brainstormed and put out last week, which are here. And sometimes it's nice to see what the overarching picture is, so those two can come together. So trying to make sure that all 8 of us currently on the subcommittee are able to sort of fit in with wherever our work styles actually sort of land. And so if working at the individual task level works for you, that's fine. I know there's a couple of us who work at this level, and to the extent that we can come together would be like super awesome.
No, I agree with you, and I think I'm working at this level too. And this level is goals that we're working towards. I'm not saying that it should be about specific tasks, but I just feel like there's an almost unlimited universe of science and data and sources and stakeholders, and it's helpful to relate this back to, and I don't know the exact language, but is it our charge? Is it the goals of this subcommittee that our tasks and work plan then flow from?
And so to piggyback on that, I think there are a couple pieces of our charge that we worked out as a group that we haven't gotten to as yet. And so I'm trying to shift us to, so for example, we haven't talked anything about the climate resilience piece. We haven't talked about some of those other pieces, you know, the adaptation piece. And so to make sure that they're not getting lost somewhere along the line, this is one way to make sure at least they're somewhere, pinned somewhere, so that when we come back to it, at least we know where they are.
And I would just add that what I heard in our earlier discussions, we were planning this, is that this is, as you said, this is the big picture universe of things that you would like to have, but it doesn't necessarily recognize, and that would be the second step, recognize what you need immediately and what is doable in the near term versus what you might need to put off for the next version or the next iteration or the next round. Or for the, so there is I think there is a parsing to be done after this initial exercise as to what is most important and needed right away for the tasks at hand.
So I want to bring up 2 things. So we only have a few minutes left, but one, and I should know this, but I'm going to maybe put Megan on the spot or another attorney that's on the line, but I don't think that we can all use this in between meetings because of that would turn into a meeting that needs to be publicly noticed. I think the guidance that we were given that we can't kind of have a shared document on Teams that we're all accessing potentially at the same time. Because that runs afoul of public meeting laws. I'm very happy for somebody to correct me if I'm wrong on that.
Hey, TJ, it's Megan. I have no correction to that. I think you're right on. Unfortunately, this is, if everyone's having access to this document and working in this document on the subcommittee, you need to warn an open meeting every time somebody modifies the document, which is not practical or fun. So and unfortunately, I think that the use of this document needs to be limited to when the subcommittee is in a warned meeting.
Right. Thank you, Megan. So I'm gonna going to suggest that folks, it's 3 categories here, so I'm confident you all can remember those categories, and that just to think about this on your own in the next week, and we will have some time at the next meeting to actually put the ideas on paper, if you will, on electronic paper. And so that was my first thought. Secondly, I wanted to, well, I guess I'm going to put you on the spot now, Catherine. I had asked about your availability for today, but not for next week in terms of this platform being available and you being able to facilitate discussion.
Let me check, but I suspect that would be fine.
Okay, thank you. I think if not, if we can still use the platform, we may be able to muddle through without you, but I think it would be a better discussion if you're able to facilitate.
Yes, I have this on hold for every week, so
Great.
yes, I'm good to go.
Okay, thank you.
Plus, because she has the account, she may need to be the one to actually open up all the stuff too. So, yeah,
that's true. So with that, I kind of want to put a pause on this because we're 3 minutes before 3 and be respectful of the scheduled meeting time. I do want to note that in the comment, well, first, thank you, George, for your comments. And as we do this in the next public meeting, I think, as Catherine mentioned, we'll hopefully have public comments come in the chat, and we'll try and incorporate those the best we can live, but also once they're in the chat, they're part of the record as well, and so we can also incorporate them after the fact. In terms of next week's meeting, Richard, you had put a comment in there about a potential presentation from Colin on the greenhouse gas inventory. That was in the draft work plan that I had put forward, and I had put dates on there. Those dates were really guesses, and they were probably all too aggressive. As of now, I think the plan for next week is to really focus on this high-level thinking here and not on the greenhouse gas inventory for next week, but that down the road, there will be more opportunity to engage on the inventory question. And I did send out a link to Colin's slides and video presentation from when he presented to the full council, and that was probably before you became a subcommittee member. That may give the kind of high level and allow us to kind of drill down a little more in the next discussion of it. So I just wanted to make sure everybody's had the right expectations for the next meeting. Are folks comfortable? Are there any objections to continuing on this path with this work planning in the next meeting? I don't hear any. Oh.
Just offer that I'm trusting and willing to follow the lead of our co-chairs. I will just note a concern that I think that it would be possible to have, it would be possible for planning and high-level conversations to happen kind of to infinity. And I want to make sure that even if I agree with you, TJ, that there may have been some aspects of that work plan that were a little bit ambitious in terms of their initial time frame, that we do start focusing on actual content and tasks that we need to do, make sure to avoid kind of talking and just at a high level or talking in circles.
Well, I'm usually too ambitious for these meetings, but do folks think that we would be able to have some high-level conversation and then start to narrow it in the next meeting, or is that further down the road?
TJ, this is Julie. I've flipped over to my phone. Is it your thought that that's all we would do? Because I think if we intend to spend the whole hour and a half on it, that seems more realistic than if we have other business we need to attend to.
I think that this is our next highest priority now that the RFP has a path forward on its own. This is my idea for next meeting.
And TJ, I think it
Okay,
is realistic to be able to prioritize and maybe even start making the connections that Jared's referring to, which is how does this connecting directly to the work plan?
Great. So what I will do, I withheld from this conversation because I knew I at least knew that we weren't going to get to that, is comments that were provided on the work plan, as I mentioned, and the questions that Richard provided. And so I will forward those out to folks because that will kind of feed in, I think, to the second, as we start to drill down. I want folks to have the benefit of those good comments and questions. So thank you. Okay, so I do want to open the floor one more time for public comment, recognizing it is after 3. Thank you everybody for sticking with us. I do feel like we were able to engage a little better. I want to think about the timing of everything, but I think we were able to engage a little better. I hope folks who are on the line felt that as well. But want to open the floor to see if there's any other public comment. George Gross, please.
Hi. I just wanted to follow up on an item I put in the chat. I mentioned that the national policy on social cost of carbon is going under review from executive order. And the National Academy of Science, in its own way, does a bunch of, I guess they call them climate conversations. And I want to bring to your attention one that occurs next Thursday. Which day is it? Let me see if I can find it again.
It's the 15th.
It's being held on Tuesday the 20th at 12 p.m. And basically, it's a opportunity to learn from people who are very much involved in that project to develop societal cost at the federal level. They're going to be explaining to the audience, basically by a webinar, basically it's going to be a moderated discussion panel, and it might be educational and a good tutorial for people who are unfamiliar with that subject. And if you'd like, I can forward it as an email to you, TJ, and perhaps Leslie Ann as well.
Yes, that'd be great. Thank you. I can pass that along to the rest of the committee.
Thank you. And by the way, I want to express my appreciation for the opportunity to interact on a more interactive level. I think it's much more constructive. Thank you.
Thank you for that feedback. Are there any other public comments? Hey, hearing none, Leslie Ann, would you have any closing thoughts?
I just wanted to recognize that we haven't been able to hear from all of our subcommittee members today, and just wanted to give the last word, time and space, to anybody who hasn't had a chance to share anything that they might want to bring to the table right now.
Richard.
Thank you for that, Leslie Ann. I wanted to echo the comment made by the third of the public members who spoke. I did not capture people's names when people were speaking. But as a general principle, and I said this before, we shouldn't collect data we're not going to use. And so if we were going to have a consumption-based inventory, perhaps as a supplement or a complement to existing inventory, it would make sense if there was a programmatic element, there was a part of the climate plan that was designed to encourage people to not buy stuff that was energy intense in its manufacture, its shipment. Absent such a program, it makes less sense to me to have a consumption-based inventory as part of our panoply of monitoring measures. So that's part of a much bigger discussion. I just wanted to say that I had heard that member of the public and that it warrants further discussion on that basis.
Thanks, Richard. Any other subcommittee members would like a final word? Okay, well, hearing none, I do agree with George that it was a little bit more interactive today, and really nice to be able to capture all of those comments and feedback. So I thank everybody for being here. Thank you for another great meeting. We look forward to continuing to learn and tweak process-wise and input-wise as we move forward. So have a great week, everybody, and we'll see you back here next Wednesday.
Take care.
Thank you, everybody. See you next week.
Thank you.
And I wasn't sure if I was still here because nobody's blinking at me.